Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. We're excited to launch our Supercharged September series on board development with who's going to do that, board structure and committees. So tonight we will be talking about a variety of different structures and how committees play within each of those board structures. Before we jump into the content, I wanted to remind everyone that the UP Nonprofit Conference is coming up Thursday, October 18th at NMU. So you can check out our website, glcyd.org, to get yourself registered. If you are a Grow and Lead member, you do get discounted rates. So be sure to jump over there and check that out after the webinar. We will be doing a case study on boards behaving badly as part of it. So you can use the knowledge you learned tonight in some of our group activities. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Chad Mager. He's an associate here at Grow and Lead and will be presenting tonight's content. Welcome, Chad.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to everyone who's taking time out of your evening and most of you post-work day to come and hear what we have to say. So hopefully the content will be solid. We're going to give you an idea of what different types of board structures are, the importance of committees, should your organization choose to use them, how they can be used, how to keep them fresh and going forward. So we'll be covering a lot of ground. And hopefully we'll get through everything tonight. There's a lot to cover. So let's just get right to it. We're going to start off tonight with a little bit of a review for those of you who have listened in on some of our webinars on boards in the past. It's good to start off with a foundation to remind you again what our roles are as board members. So the three legal duties of board members, keep these always in mind. You have a duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And so your duty of care is paying attention to the organization's activities and operations, making reasonable decisions as you're playing that oversight role and taking care of the organization. Loyalty is putting the interest of the organization before yourself, before your own interests. And the duty of obedience is obviously it's compliance to all different laws and regulations that affect the organization that you are serving, and also to the organization's own bylaws, which help govern your activities. And also you are the guardians of the mission, meaning as a board member, you are really the overwatcher, if you want to call it, to make sure the organization is adhering to the mission that the organization was created to accomplish. So those are just a little bit of review to remind you of the importance of the roles that board members play, and those will come into play here too with especially that duty of care. Now, what does it look like when you're paying attention or helping the organization with its activities or operations? And so one of the ways you'll find out is possibly serving on other task force or committees. So let's start off though, the very beginning, the very basics are the couple different ways that the structures are used to carry out those duties. And there are three main types of structures used for boards. We've found in our work at Grow and Lead across the Upper Peninsula and beyond that there is a really not a solid understanding of the type of board that you're serving on. And so we'll talk tonight a little bit about what a working board structure is, what a governing board structure is, and what an institutional board structure is. And so you can kind of take a look at your own organization in the light of this information, see which one you're currently operating at, and then determine whether that's where you should be operating at or not. So let's start off with what's considered a working board. So this graph can help us a little bit. The working board structure is exactly what it sounds like. The board is doing a lot of work. It's a lot more hands-on than the other two structures we'll be talking about. Working boards are typically newer or smaller nonprofit organizations. So the board has to still keep that high level. They're setting policy, they're setting budget. They are the visionaries and looking at things strategically. So they still have this high view of the organization. They're still responsible for that. But then they get down to the next level where you also could serve on work groups or committees or task force. And on top of that, you also are getting your hands into the work, the technical level of the organization by volunteering in various roles. And the primary reason is because typically these size organizations, again, are brand new. So it's all hands on deck. They need all the help they can get, or they have very few or sometimes even no staff, no paid staff. So the board ends up serving as everything. Volunteers, they also do committees, they also keep the overarching oversight for the organization. So a working board truly is working. They are heavily involved, heavily invested, time commitment level on making sure the mission and the organization keeps going strong. It's labor intensive. It's meant to be only for a season. Now, some of you on here might be going, wait a second, we've been operating like that for 10 years. So you might be looking at a time possibly of transition to something, a different model, which might help alleviate and also give more separations and delineation between, especially if you have more staff, paid staff than you might have had 10 years ago. There are distinct duties that staff should do versus what a board member should assist with. And as you grow as an organization, you get bigger, you should find yourself kind of getting to a point where you're outgrowing this working board model. But again, as a new startup, as a really, really small organization, it's really is all hands on deck. And so the working board structure really fits and works. But as your organization grows, you add staff. So now that the demand on board members is not as much, the natural progression is to a governing board structure. So what's different? So obviously you're still setting policies and budget that big. You're still casting that vision and those strategies, just like we saw in the first one. But now, instead of being involved in all the different parts and all different levels of the organization, this is where that committee structure, which we'll talk about in far more in depth in a little bit, but this is where in a governing board structure, committees come into play. So they are very specific committees, and they label them here as a strategic committee, picked to do an important role at the board level to help serve the organization. Some of the most common committees that are formed are a board governance committee, which helps recruit, train, orient new board members, helps with the makeup of the board. Usually there's an executive committee of the officers, and there might be a few other ones in there. A finance committee to bring additional oversight to the finances, and often to a fund development, or some of you know it as fundraising committees. So those are common ones we'll talk about in a little bit. But these committees now play a significant role in doing some of the hands-on work, but now the burden is spread out. It's only a couple board members on the committees. It's sharing the load, but again, they're looking at things at a higher level than on the working board, which was hands-on and getting things done. So these are definitely meant to address issues that are more critical to completing your mission and strategies. And it has less the volunteer, hands-on volunteer role that you saw was so heavy in the base of the working board model is now is kind of replaced. That doesn't mean board members don't volunteer at events or in other places in the organization, but their time that they normally would pour in additionally into volunteerism now is spent more in the committee activities because there's work to be done on that level, which is a little bit, just one step higher. So that's kind of how that goes. A lot of our medium-sized nonprofits, even up to large ones, find themselves in this model as the most effective, or and also helps with sharing the load and not overburdening. Again, the working board is really heavy, time intensive and really labor intensive as far as how much time you're giving. The governing board takes a little bit of that off your plate, gives you a little bit more higher view of things and work on bigger issues, and leave typically some of the stuff that the working board board members would be volunteering for are now covered by staff, paid staff, or if the organization actually actively recruits volunteers, then recruited volunteers will take over those things, and then the board members don't have to do that kind of work anymore. So it's just like growing up, you know. Let's just think of a life cycle of a human. The working board structure is meant to be that infant to the toddler to young kid, which needs more hands-on, does it not, to help them keep safe and grow as they go along. And now we're getting to the governing board structure. There's a little bit more solid foundation on their feet. They don't stumble as much and wobble. So the board takes a step back and tries to guide from a little bit higher viewpoint. All right, we'll talk more about this as we go along too. But the last one's the institutional board structure. This is for, I like to call it the big boys, the large organizations, because they are really hands off. There is not so much, there's not the committees, or usually if they are, they're usually ad hoc, really short term little work groups that happen, not standing committees. So these are large ones. You think about large corporations that have the corporate boardroom, even your university levels have your board of trustees or board of regents or whatever it is. That's the kind of structure that is an institutional board structure. For those of you here in the UP, there are not a ton of these kind of big ones around here, especially not in the nonprofit outside of the university. The hospital used to be one of those, but now as a for-profit is not governed as a nonprofit, that is, by this board structure. So higher end level, really high end level stuff. But we don't have any currently in our membership that we're working with at this level, so it's pretty big. Clear roles, clear differentiation and delineation between staff and board. So it's pretty cut and dried. They are there. Big picture type stuff. Far less worried about how it's getting done. So I just wanted to give this graphic to show that there is a life cycle of a nonprofit board. And I kind of showed you that infancy, that beginning stage of the working board. As you grow and mature as an organization, there's a natural transition out of having board members do so much and being so hands-on to more of a governing role where they can still participate and still be involved in volunteering, but they're now the bulk of their time will go to higher end stuff and also serving in work groups or committees. So their time is spent more in that than is on the boots on the ground, so to speak, work. And finally, if you really start to grow to a much more formalized and large organization, you may make it to the institutional style of boards. So that's the life cycle, and it's really about a maturing it's not just years as your organization matures, because there are some organizations that have remained small, maybe sometimes on purpose, and never get out of the working board stage. Maybe they never get to the place where they hire staff who then takes on some of those roles and duties. So but as it matures and as you grow, you'll notice a different needs and a different way of operating your board. So just keep that in mind, that it's a life cycle. In other words, really point out that there's no wrong way for a board. The board should match what is needed from the organization. What do they need in their board? And then obviously apply that. So if you're an organization looking and you feel like you're in one of these transition stages and need help, don't be afraid to reach out to us here at Grow and Lead, because we help organizations make that transition, because it's not always easy. Board members are confused. Sometimes even executive directors are confused on how that process works or why it's necessary. A lot of boards are worried that moving from a working board to a committee structure, a governing board, is going to be more work, and they don't realize it's actually sometimes less work because you're sharing the load. So we can always help communicate that. So another little bit of review before we head on into talking more about committees and their structure and everything is a review of the 3 hats of the roles that board members have in an organization. And just to make sure we're clear on this one, the 3 hats that you wear are governance, implementation, and a volunteer. Just to remind you that the only time you have actual authority and power as a board member, excuse me, is when you are formally meeting in a boardroom. The meeting's called to order. Now you are given the powers of a board member. So the board is the ultimate legal and moral authority. And when you meet together and you make quorum, now you can act as an entity by the power of your vote. So this is when you have your formal power. That's important to keep in mind because sometimes board members, Victoria mentioned one of our phrases around here, boards behaving badly. It's a cute phrase she came up with. But often board members forget that outside of the boardroom, you don't have authority or power in your organization. Your power is in your vote. So remember that. You can't be throwing around that I'm a board member out in public to someone just to get your way, because that doesn't work that way. You're only one of however many serve on your board, one of a dozen or whatever, and you have one vote. That's where your power lies. But outside of that, you really can't be pushing people around or dictating things as you see fit. So that's your governance role. It's an extremely important one. It's the one that keeps us legal even. It's the voting and taking of minutes is crucial to keeping an organization legal. That's your biggest, most important function. Implementation is one that we'll talk about a lot tonight. This is the delegated authority that the board gives, and they gives that authority and authorization to a certain group of people for a specific reason. Let me cut to the chase. It's the committees, often we're talking about here. In other words, a committee, when formed by a vote of the board, has a specific function, specific goals, specific objectives that they're supposed to accomplish, and they have authority within that defined area, and that's it. So they have case in point, you have a finance committee perhaps, who is on an ongoing basis working with the bookkeepers, accountants, whatever of the nonprofit organization to make sure the finances are in order, the things are being filed. And when it comes time for an audit, they're typically the group that's going to go out and research and find competitive bids to have someone come and audit the finances of the organization. So they're given the authority to go out, hey, get us some quotes, get us the right people that fit what we need, and then they bring it back to the board for a vote. But that's the delegating that authority to go out, help us make this decision, do some research, do your work, and then inform the rest of the board. So it's not have to be done at every single meeting itself. So it's very specific, and it's for a specific reason. And the board is the one that approves the power given. So you do wear this delegate mode from time to time as necessary. And the last hat you wear is the volunteer hat, which again, you end up, for most organizations, you end up doing a lot of the time. You end up volunteering at events, at fundraisers. Sometimes you're out doing something completely different and you have a chance to be an ambassador and be a voice for your organization. In that mode, in that moment, you're strictly volunteering to be a spokesperson, which is great. But again, remembering that outside the boardroom, there's no real individual authority that a board member has. And that's important to remember. That's why teamwork becomes so important. And we'll talk more about how you can share the work necessary for an organization. All right, moving along. So we're going to talk about committees, which I'm guessing is a big reason why people are on this webinar tonight. So committees can feel like herding cattle, hence the graphic. The idea of when you're working with committees are just like, getting people to move in a similar direction towards common objectives and goals sometimes can be challenging. I just can't get over this. This slide makes me laugh. Okay. So let's look at, again, what committees really are, the role they play in the organization. Why are they important? Why do we even deal with them? Why, if we're switching to a governing board, do we want to even deal with this stuff? So I'll kind of explain a lot of that. So again, the committee's role is a very limited and specific authority to a specific set of objectives and goals. In other words, essentially they're given a job to do, and that's the job they do. They can't go outside of that given structure or parameters. They have to stick to that. So if you have a board governance committee, as an example, their job is to really help start the process of recruiting and nominating new potential board members. When the board members come on board, they help with the orientation and getting them caught up to speed. They're looking to make sure the board's diverse, but everything in that, if you notice, it's all about the board. It's about the board, and it's about replacing the board and adding people and keeping up on the terms of the different board members. So again, their specific authority is limited to a single set of goals and objectives. So once you start seeing committees that are overreaching their authority, it's something that the board should address immediately, because that committee has not been given that authority in a different area other than what's been stated. Greatly encourage you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, make sure those are written down. The more things are written down, the less likelihood that there's gonna be confusion about what their role actually is. The committee's main purpose and function is to make recommendations to the board. So they do their work, they do their research, they plan, they dig into things, they find help, and then once they've completed or gotten to the point where they have something, they take it to a board meeting and present their recommendations to the board. So again, a committee, again, that limited authority. They can't actually make full-fledged in-stone decisions. They still need to recommend to the board, and then the board, again, going back to your power, uses the power of the vote, whether to accept or send back recommendations made to the board. This is, again, the sharing of the responsibilities, the sharing of the work, so that the whole board doesn't have to sit around in a board meeting and try to figure out every single problem on every single level and every topic in an organization. This will cut down board meetings to a very manageable length of time if work can be done outside of the boardroom in a committee structure. The last point on the screen about roles is the different types of committees. There are standing committees. Standing committees mean they're ongoing. That means you set them up at the beginning of the year, or maybe your organization has always had A, B, C, D type of committees, and they just keep going forever. And all you do is, as the parts of your organization change and as the people change, then obviously being appointed or serving on those committees changes, but they keep going every year. It's the same standing committees. Versus there's another way to possibly do it, is using more short-term type of groups that are, you can call them committees, but I used a bunch of different terms that are used in the industry of ad hoc, a temporary committee, a task force, a work group. And sometimes, because you don't need an ongoing committee, or there's not enough work for a committee to keep meeting all the time. And one of the worrisome things about committees is that people get burned out when they keep meeting and there's nothing to actually do if they've completed their assignment, so to speak. So sometimes short-term types of committees are very beneficial. And sometimes there's an issue that arises in your organization that only needs a very temporary or short-term work group to take care of that. So what the biggest thing about this is your mileage may vary type of idea. This is exactly, what does your organization need? Does it need ongoing standing committees that have to address these consistent issues and strategies that need to be accomplished, or can small, temporary, limited groups be set up as needed to tackle certain issues. So in fact, there was one type of structure that some organizations partake in called a zero-based committee structure. So when you're concerned about a committee, an ongoing committee becoming cumbersome or just drags on without a clear vision or a clear role, some boards use this zero-based committee structure because it forces boards to constantly reevaluate their work groups. And so here's how it works. The board starts off every year or every 2 years, depending on what works best for your organization, with a clean slate of no committees. None. That's the zero. None. So at the very beginning of the year, the board begins to determine its organizational strategy and priorities, and then they establish what they deem to be necessary standing committees and or task force based on its current needs. So, and these groups are formed with an understanding that the group will disband once its objective is met, or if the board decides the group should disband at its next annual review of committees. So again, it's going into the year with nothing, and then as things develop, whether it's you take a look at your priorities for the upcoming year and say, okay, so what do we need to help support the work of the board and the organization, and then only set up those committees. So it's a different way of looking at it, and it keeps things fresh. It can be confusing if you're not on top of things, but it is one option to keep in mind so that you don't have those standing committees that everyone just goes, oh, we're meeting for no reason and there's nothing to do, which is a burden that you really don't want to have to face. So there's just some of the roles the committees play. And then we have structures of committees. And this means, okay, Chad, so you named several committees before. So what ones should we have? And then I drop this one on you. No board committee structure should be set in stone just because of what you talked about with the zero-based one. I have worked with at least 2 organizations in the past year that have in their organizational bylaws a very robust committee structure. In fact, one of them had something close to 10 different standing committees outlined in their bylaws. That is extremely inflexible. In other words, because it's their bylaws and because you as board members are bound to uphold your bylaws, that board was strapped to the limit of trying to fill 10 different committees because they're required to. Talk about cumbersome, talk about burnout, talk about why is it hard to recruit new board members when they look at that structure and go, whoa, that's a lot of committees. So the recommendation, believe it or not, is to not put your committee structure in your bylaws. That's something different than how we used to tell people to do things. The only committee that's encouraged to be in your bylaws is an executive committee, if your organization has one. That one should be outlined and defined. The rest of them, leave yourself some room to keep things simple and keep yourselves, most importantly, flexible, so that your committees or work groups can change as the needs of your organization changes. So if you do have that in your bylaws, currently you're going, yeah, we got like 6, 7 committees or whatever, and it's being a detriment to have those standing committees, it might be time to look at your bylaws and go, wait a second, do we need to have these all outlined in our bylaws? It might serve you to be less is more sometimes. Keep it simple, sweetie, right? So so then again, you should always be evaluating is an ongoing basis to see if that structure, whatever committees you do decide to hold, whether they're standing or otherwise, make sure they're actually doing and serving the way they're meant to. The moment you have a committee that's operating and it's just getting boring and cumbersome and there's not enough work to keep them focused and moving forward, it's a good time to really look at it and say, maybe we don't need this and it's a good time to disband this, rather than burn out board members for unnecessary or unneeded committees. So another thing to keep in mind as you're looking at your board committees, again, I want to reemphasize that last point about the need to evaluate and reevaluate your boards, your board committees. I have a list here of questions that you should ask yourselves regularly and see if it applies to you and it helps you guide to know, are the committees we have currently, are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? Are they actually benefiting the organization? And so I'm just going to read off. I'm not going to read the whole list. It's like a dozen, but a few things is to ask yourselves, do the board members feel their participation in committees provides them with a way to contribute to the board's work and use their expertise that they maybe don't feel like they're getting in regular meetings? So at a regular meeting, they have an expertise in finance, but there's not a real lot of discussion about that. So serving on a finance committee might really help someone feel more engaged, more like they're using their expertise. Let's see. Do your board committees foster rather than hinder board and staff interaction and cooperation? Do they deepen the board's understanding of issues that have impact on the organization? So in other words, are they more, is there a committee getting you more detached from the organization or actually getting you more attached to the organization? Obviously, the second is what you want. Do all of your committees have an objective? Do they have a lifespan? In other words, if you meet certain things, are they necessary anymore? Or are we just meeting for the sake of meeting? Are any of your board members confused about the committees or their committee roles? You'll find that happens a lot if you start asking your board members, what are you doing on that committee exactly? I don't know, I'm just supposed to show up. Big one, are your committees duplicating another committee's work or staff's work? There's one you want to avoid. If you're paying someone to do a job, don't have a committee that's going and doing similar or the same exact thing. That's redundant, and as soon as the board members who are serving on the committees figure that out, they'll be very discouraged and what am I doing here? So do your board have so many committees that your board members are being stretched thin and having to attend too many meetings? I know of an organization that cut their committees going through this process, asking these tough questions from 8 down to 5. And then they also looked even further at evaluating to realize that most of their committees could get by with either, depending on the committee, either a quarterly meeting, which they used to be meeting monthly. Think about that in a time difference. Meeting every month versus meeting once a quarter to get your work done. Can you say they had way too many meetings if they felt like they could now get it done in a quarter? By the way, it was a finance committee saying we can review these on a quarterly basis. We don't have to meet every month. And another one realizing that one committee only needed to meet every other month rather than every single month. So the amount of meetings they cut down on was drastic, and the amount of committees was pared back. And so it was amazing being in that boardroom as they're making these discussions and recommendations, because you could feel like this burden lift off people's shoulders. It's like, yes, less meetings, yes, less committees. So making sure you're asking, are we pulling our people too many ways? Are we stretching them too thin? Like the organization that had 10 committees in their bylaws really realized real fast that that was just not sustainable. So committee size, are you looking at saying, is there too many people serving on a committee, or is there not enough people on a committee to make sure it's being effective and getting the work it needs to get done? Yeah, so don't ask me right in the question saying, what's a good committee size? That really is directly related to the tasks. What do you need to get done? How many people does it take to get done? So, that has to be, again, flexible, and you have to keep observing and watching. So, all right. I think that's good for that one. One thing I want to make sure I mention about committees as we're talking about their structure is who sits on them. Obviously, if the board's giving power in a specific area and a specific limited authority, there needs to be at least one board member, preferably even 2, to serve on each committee. That's kind of very important, so that the board has a representative and the work's getting done. And that's the person they're really empowering in that committee. However, a committee doesn't have to be made up of just board members. And in fact, I would greatly encourage you to look outside your board members to add to your committee some outside experts, outside viewpoints. So recruiting more people to your committees to help share the load is a great and a healthy thing to do for your organization. The board person who represents, any board member that is on a committee is a great advocate to get those people, but the whole board can work on that if they know of someone who's an expert. Again, going back to the finance, if you don't have currently someone with a finance or accounting background serving on your board, but you know someone who wouldn't mind coming to a couple committee meetings to help guide, they're a great person to recruit to your committee, finance committee, even if they can't commit to being on your board. The other thing that helps when bringing outside people in, sometimes again, we have blinders on when we're serving an organization. We can only see what's in front of us. And so outside perspectives can be really beneficial, whether again, it's finance or fundraising or searching for board members. Think about that. If the board is always perpetuating and recruiting to replace itself, but if your board governance committee has outside influences, that opens up the eyes and networks to even more people beyond what's currently in your board. So think about that. Think about experts. Think about people that have the skill sets that might really be beneficial to your committee, and recruit them to serve on a committee rather than the full commitment of the board. What we can also have found has happened, not all the time, but often happens, is that you get to see that person in action for a while, and eventually it's a perfect way to a stepping stone from serving on a committee into eventually maybe board service. So by that time, that person has a very good understanding of at least one part of the workings of your organization. So they've been invested for a while. So it serves as a good recruiting ground for your board membership eventually. So the other thing about committee structure is very important to remember is have a chair, someone who's going to set the meetings, get people involved, follow up, kind of lead that, and make sure that the objectives of the committee is always kept in the forefront of all the members' minds. So have a chair for your committee and have someone who does document and take notes. Whether you call that person a secretary or not, the title's not important, but have someone who is capturing notes so that when you make your recommendations as a committee to the board eventually for the work you've been doing, you have record of it. You have record of the vote, you have record of the work you've done and who did what. It just makes things a lot easier to follow up and get some clarification once that time comes. So keep track of your notes, have someone leading the charge so you're not like wandering around in the desert, and that'll make things a little bit more smoother. All right, moving right along here. And lastly, again, I think I mentioned this earlier too, once your objective is completed, once you're done, the discussion should really be had. And I think most committee people would be very excited to have that conversation with the overall board of whether it's still needed. If you've completed the tasks you've been given, don't be afraid to disband, because here's the thing, if you keep it flexible and don't have a firm committee structure in your bylaws, you can always come back and restart a committee once the need arises again. So don't be afraid to disband or postpone or stop a committee if this need is not necessary anymore. Okay, so as I've mentioned before, your organization has your needs. Every organization is different. Every organization has a different set of priorities on an annual or every few years basis. And so your committees, should you have them, should reflect the need. However, there are some pretty standard and typical committees that most organizations do have, and often, not always, but often are standing committees. And so I picked at least 4. So if you are one of these organizations going, we don't have committees, but I think we need them, where should we start? Again, I think you really should look at your organization's needs, but this is a good place to start. Board governance, I talked about a little bit. What you don't ever want to get to, and actually we'll talk about this in 2 weeks. I'm doing another webinar on recruiting board members, board recruitment. So your governance, your board governance committee is one that starts that process. They look to look for potential board members, and they're also the ones evaluating board performance, which is really good, kind of self-evaluating. How are we doing overall as a board? So they'll be the ones that kind of bring that up. They're also the ones that looks for ongoing training, so that we can keep upgrading our skills and our knowledge what it means to serve as a board of directors. So the governance does a lot, again, with replacing the board itself. A lot of organizations, unfortunately, look to staff for recommendations for potential board members, or even use staff, paid staff, to go and recruit, actively have those conversations. That's technically a board role. And so having a committee that's devoted to that can really be a helpful thing. They will help keep the board sharp, diverse, and fresh, and make sure that term limits are being, if you have terms, are being honored. And that's should never be a scary thing. Terms are good because it helps with revitalizing and re-energizing people when they serve. So that's a typical one, is your board governance, because you never want to get to the point where all of a sudden you're down to only a couple board members going, oh boy, what do we do now? So always looking to replace those who have left for whatever reason. Development can also be called the fundraising. If there's any nonprofit on this webinar that doesn't need to raise funds, please call us, because we want to know your secret. So most of you actually have to raise funds in some way, whether it's writing for grants, soliciting individual donations, and a lot of you probably throw fundraising events. So your development committee is the one that will typically brainstorm and come up with the different streams of funding that could help the organization. Again, going back to some of the duties and roles of a board, one of the things that is important is that financial piece of making sure that budget is met. So having a development committee can be very helpful in coming up with ideas on how to make sure the funding is there to do all of the work of your organization. So that's slightly different than finance, which finance is looking at your investments. It's looking at your trends in your budget, and just the financial oversight. So they're anticipating any financial problems. They're looking at adopting and addressing fiscal policies. They are kind of like the safeguards for your organizational assets. And they should hopefully serve as a great teacher to the rest of the board to understand financial statements, because often that's something that the general board member is afraid of or does not understand. And so a finance committee, again, especially if you can get some outside people who are really good at finance and are experts, whether they're bankers or accountants or whatever it might be, they can really help educate the rest of the board on the financial aspect, which is so important, obviously, and so many nonprofits stumble in this area. So in our encouragement even is, typically you have a staff person who's preparing your budget or monitoring your income, but the finance committee actually does oversight and reviews all those things. So when they review the financial statements, they're going to say, are we on track? If we're not, why? What's going on? And one encouragement, I just read this in a book actually not too long ago about boards, is a great encouragement they're making now to have in the life cycle of serving on committees. If you have a board that changes committees on an annual basis, is to encourage every board member to serve at least 1 year on the finance committee. And I know some people out there, are you crazy? I'm not going to have Susie do that. She can't count, let alone. But the point is why they make the suggestion of everyone having a term on the finance committee is it helps them understand, have a greater understanding, and optimizes their knowledge about the organization's finances to a level they may never on their own want to dig into. They might just glance at the financial statements in a meeting and go, okay, yeah, that's good. They know better than I. But serving on the finance committee can help educate somebody to have a deeper understanding of all that's involved in an organization's finances. So keep that in mind for anyone who's afraid to serve on that committee. It might be beneficial as long as you have other solid finance people there to help. And the last one is probably one of the more important ones, is the executive committee. Most organizations actually have this, most have it in their bylaws. So they're required to have an executive committee, which is usually made up of all the officers of the board. So in other words, your board chair, if you have a vice chair, the treasurer and secretary. Sometimes in some organizations, the chairs of the other standing committees can serve on the executive committee. And whoever your chief executive or your executive director is actually a member of this group too, as an ex officio member. So this group, essentially what they're there for is they help the board carry out the work. And specifically, it's kind of they've been known to do the work and make decisions and have authority to make decisions on behalf of the full board when the full board's not in session or meeting. So obviously it sounds like an important role. If something pops up and immediate attention needed, a quick called executive committee can help through crisis and can help get the thing started. They work really closely with the chief executive on a regular basis, more than just having that person deal with the whole board. It kind of narrows it down a little bit. Some of the dangers and things to worry about and kind of watch when it comes to executive committees, this is kind of those tips for pitfalls, is sometimes executive committees have been known to assume too much autonomy, and they kind of start taking over board decision making, and some of the board then's left kind of disengaged or alienated. So if you have an executive committee, which I recommend, it's a really good group and can get lots done, makes the process kind of streamlined. However, make sure that everything they're doing is, very well communicated to the whole board. And don't be afraid to ask the question for the other board members of the executive committee to say, the executive committee actually should ask others to say, do you feel like we're overstepping, or do you think we're not telling you enough? So again, make a decision, but usually executive committee is something that's in most organizations. It's usually the one in your bylaws, but the rest of your committees don't have to be. Okay, let's see, let's keep going then. That's just 4 examples. I'm sure you could probably give me dozens and dozens more examples of committees that you may have served on, or your organization might have a different one or a different name. Again, these are 4 common ones, 4 very practical ones, but the committee structure and examples of committees needs to be whatever it helps your organization. So it might be something very different. I'm trying to think of an example. An arts organization has one about, I think it's like procuring different artworks and whatever. They had like an arts committee that was specifically different than this, so that the assisting the lone paid employee on finding new works of art to bring in was something the committee assisted with. And so very specific to that organization, but a committee nonetheless. All right, tips for committees. I had mentioned earlier, not relying just on your board members. That's a good way to burn them out. Find help, share the load, find other people that have an interest or a passion or an expertise in whatever that the goals and objectives that committee is formed to take on, and get them involved. Ask for that volunteer to help serve. At Grow and Lead, I don't think this is it's a secret or anything, but we have someone serving on our finance committee that is a very good financial mind in our community. He's not a board member, and he is a huge asset to that committee. In fact, I've heard stories. I haven't sat in that committee, but that he's done a great job of educating board members and even some staff that serve on that committee in the ways of our finances. And so just a huge asset, but again, not a board member, just someone who volunteers and has a set of skills that was really needed for that committee. So Look for those. If you're looking at board governance, the perfect person to look at is who are those socialites that know everybody. Those are great because you can get into those different networks. So find someone who's not a board member but loves to be connected to people who help bring you names and ideas and knows what people are up to, and you can tap into their resources and their outgoingness. So yeah, look for people outside your board members and don't rely on them, because I'm telling you right now, 2-people committees of just board members is not great. It doesn't really help get the job done. For every committee, make sure they have set goals and objectives, that they have a purpose. And not only do they have that, but they have enough work, especially if it's an ongoing committee. Make sure there's enough for them to do. And if there's not, it's time to maybe let that committee go for now and disband. But the worst thing to do and to frustrate your board is to have a committee that's not doing any work, not accomplishing anything, not contributing. It makes actually for bitter board members who feel like they're required to attend a meeting and not getting anything accomplished. So make sure if you're going to form a committee, a task force, a work group, an ad hoc, whatever, that they do have a purpose and there's enough work to get done. And then when it's done, let it go. Guidelines for your committees. When the board forms or suggests to form a committee, make sure the guidelines and the parameters for that committee is made in writing. The last thing you want to do is at future board meetings argue about who is supposed to do what and how much they overstepped their bounds or they did things they shouldn't do or they weren't allowed to do. Again, keep it simple and keep it clean. Set out their guidelines so they know exactly how much rope they have to get the job done. Put it in writing so you have something to refer back to. And then as you do the work in your committees, make sure you're keeping good records of the work done, decisions made at the committee level, and I forgot to put this, and the recommendations they are going to propose and give to the board. Those are pretty key points. Keeping good records and tracking those things make for happier people when they know who said what and why we came to this decision, and not scratching your heads a month later going, I don't know why we decided to do that. So write it down, keep records. I know everyone doesn't like doing that. I'm not exactly a favorite for note taking. So to review the 3 different types of board structures, we have the working board, which is for the younger or smaller organization that's getting off the ground or maybe doesn't have any staff. You're all in, you're heavily involved. You have the governing board structure, which starts to form committees to do some of those tasks, leaving now the newly hired or whatever the staff in place to do a lot of the work of the organization because it's matured. And lastly, the institutional board, which is very much overseers and kind of really detached from the everyday work and even committee structure, rather just sees an oversight, which is usually for very large organizations or corporations. And then when it comes to committees, remembering that really form a committee only as needed. If you have standing committees, make sure there's enough work for them to do. Make sure your executive committee is actively doing things but not overstepping their bounds and taking too much authority. Recruit to get more people involved, to give more perspective and ideas. The more eyes and the more minds you have on different projects and goals and objectives, the better. Make sure you're keeping diverse in your committees. In other words, have a little different, find someone who's a little bit outside the box on something to help with it, not just someone you know would be best. Diversity helps. Diversity brings different viewpoints and perspectives. Make sure committees have a purpose, they have a goal, well-defined parameters in writing, and don't be afraid to get rid of committees when they've stopped being useful or they've done their purpose. They've accomplished their task. Don't be afraid to let them go. So thank you very, very much for listening in. I hope that was a lot of good information for you to figure out what's the best next step for your organization, where you are in the life cycle. of an organization as far as the board structure and the committees are what you need to do, or maybe it's just short-term work groups or ad hocs that really will help you accomplish. But whatever it is, you have to define that for yourself and figure out what your needs are. Don't be afraid to reevaluate, to relook at things and circle back around to make sure they're actually accomplishing what they've meant to do in the first place. So from Grow and Lead, I'm Chad. Thank you very much. If you want to check us out on Facebook or our webpage, if you have questions for me, feel free to email me. And I believe that Victoria will be sending out copies, a link to this broadcast and also the slides later on. So don't forget, October 18th, coming up pretty fast, is our nonprofit conference. So we hope to see a lot of you there. It's going to be a pretty interesting and fun year this year, a little bit different than what we've done in the past. So I hope you'll come and check it out. So thank you again for hanging out on a Wednesday evening, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks.